She hated men so much that she wanted to do in the ones that she came in contact with.
These are the stories of terrible deeds.
There were the kings and queens. They decided about life and death.
Of crimes written in blood on history's pages.
The court decided that she was sane and she could have been the person next door.
She had a death wish. She'd killed the only thing she ever loved and she wanted to die.
Across time and across continents, something united these murderers.
Some women believe that they are entitled to kill a man who cheats on them.
They were driven by the emotion of the ages.
They say about 45 to 60 minutes it took the patients to die.
The darkest force of all.
It was hard for me to say, well, how could any human do that to any other human?
For these deadly women, it was time for revenge.
She was madly in love with him, desperately in love with him, and he wasn't with her.
Police Detective Sergeant Bob Wells tries to forget the day he discovered one of Australia's most shocking crimes.
You just sort of have lost the majority of your senses for a short period of time until you actually regathered them and realised that it was reality and not a horror scene.
Daily swims are an attempt to wash away the images still lurking in his subconscious.
Clothing, cutlery, meat. It's something I'm still trying to come to grips with even today, emotionally and mentally.
Bob Wells would be just one of the lives forever changed by the deeds of Catherine Knight.
I think most of us expect somebody who's done what Catherine's done to have horns growing out of her head or to be restrained like Hannibal Lecter. But she was a very ordinary-looking woman.
Another to be affected would be journalist and author Peter Lawler, assigned to a story his newspaper couldn't publish.
Editors make a decision whether a story is palatable for people to read with their breakfast in the morning, and there was a decision made that this one wasn't palatable. It couldn't be reported. It was too horrific.
But like many, Catherine drew him in.
I wanted to know that a person who could do what Catherine Knight did was insane or not sentient. But the court decided that she was sane and she could have been the person next door.
Catherine Knight seemed to live on the edge.
She had a wild temper. She had too many boyfriends, too many fathers for the children. She came from a wild family.
By her early 40s, Catherine had experienced 4 rocky relationships. Each time, she was asked to leave. But each time, she found her way back.
She knew how to keep a bloke happy. She put up their mates drinking in the shed. She had dinner ready when they got home. Generally, she knew how to keep a bloke, and she was manipulative like that.
I think she was a very hard woman, very strong physically. I think she probably emotionally very vulnerable.
Her fiancé, John Price, was the type of man Catherine sought out.
She was a tough country girl, and they were tough country blokes. They loved to drink. They liked their knees up on a Saturday night.
But all too soon, each partner discovered Catherine's secret. An illness called borderline personality disorder.
Borderline personality disorder is kind of a catch-all term for a condition that manifests itself, the individual, and it's usually women, it can be men, very moody, tremendous mood swings.
Former FBI criminal profiler Candace DeLong says sufferers can turn quickly from lovers to fighters.
They feel slighted when there was no slight. They are prone to being very suspicious that their partner is cheating on them. Everything reflects back to somebody is taking advantage of me, and I must do something about it.
John Price usually weathered the stormy Catherine, knowing the loving Catherine would soon return. Then one day, his partner went over the line, threatening his job at the coal mine with a home video.
She'd filmed the contents of his garden shed, and in Pricey's garden shed was a first aid kit from the mine, which he'd allegedly stolen.
The pair had argued over money. Catherine wanted revenge. She sent the video to the mine boss, suggesting John was a thief.
The most important thing in most men's lives is their job. And that is the one area that the woman may feel if she can mess this up for him, all the better.
John was fired.
He threw her out of the house, said he'd never have her back. Unfortunately, he had her back within 6 months because Catherine turned on the sweet, loving side again and got back in there somehow.
And I think that there was more so a physical attraction towards her than anything else.
One man knew what John Price was going through.
Well, her mother said to me, just after we first got married, she said, "You want to watch this one? If you do the wrong thing by, she will kill you."
Catherine's first husband, David Kellett.
And I brushed it off as just one of those things that mothers say, and it didn't really dawn on me that, but one day she would go over the edge.
In late 1999, David and John met to compare notes.
I knew John Price, and he said to me he wants to get out of a relationship, but he's scared to get out. And I said, well, these days you can take all these domestic violence orders against each other, whatever. And he was just so scared, he was almost shaking. He was really scared.
Little did either man know, Catherine would soon commit one of Australia's most shocking crimes.
We don't have a lot of women on death row, but that's where she is, and she holds Bible studies, Bible sessions within death row.
In 1990, journalist Martha Quillen found the story of her career in North Carolina.
People thought she was such a fine person, and how could she have done this? And yet, the reality of what she had done was so brutal and so cruel that people were just fascinated in this dual personality in this one woman.
To the world, Blanche Taylor Moore was a caring Christian, a compassionate woman, led by spiritual commitment. So when her boyfriend Raymond Reed was hospitalized, no one was surprised at Blanche's constant care.
She was sort of beloved, I think, on the floor where he stayed, and the nurses testified that they thought she was a wonderful person and very caring, and that, you know, Raymond was very lucky to have someone like that come in to see him.
Raymond was diagnosed with Guillain-Barré syndrome.
Guillain-Barré syndrome is also known as French polio. It is an autoimmune disorder. The symptoms are muscle weakness, nerve tingling, progressive fatigue, and eventually may even lead to difficulty breathing.
Despite the best care, Raymond was destined to die. Again and again.
He actually died and was revived. His heart failed and he had kidney failure and died, and they revived him.
Several times, Raymond died a clinical death, losing heartbeat and respiration. But each time, expert medical staff pulled him back from the brink. Each time, Blanche was waiting with more comfort.
Apparently she took great care in preparing this food because hospital food was just not good enough for the man that she loved.
But whenever Raymond regained strength, there was another relapse.
Think of the worst flu you've ever had, multiply it by 100, and then lengthen it by 2 or 3 hours.
And another resuscitation. A terrifying roller coaster of life and death.
He's confused and frightened and, thinking he's going to die, and then he begins to get better, and then he starts to die again. And they say it's a horrible death. It's a really horrible way to die.
Raymond Reed died the final time in October 1986.
In my experience of writing about murders and covering murder trials, I think they all think that they're smarter than everybody else, and they're not going to be caught.
Within 2 years, Blanche had moved on into the arms of Reverend Dwight Moore.
He was a minister who courted her and pursued her, and she finally married him.
It seemed a match made in heaven. But during the honeymoon, the Reverend fell deathly ill. Although the symptoms mimicked Guillain-Barré syndrome, the speed of onset raised suspicions.
He happened to end up in a hospital where they had the smarts to test him for arsenic poisoning. And when they found huge doses of arsenic in his system, they immediately suspected that she had given it to him.
Reverend Moore's constitution foiled Blanche's plan. Against the odds, he survived.
Investigators later said that he had survived the largest dose of arsenic any human was ever known to have survived. So she was just unlucky. She poisoned someone whose system was stronger than she was.
Blanche would be charged with assault, and police probed further, exhuming the body of Raymond Reed. The chief medical examiner in North Carolina, John Butts, MD, exposed one of the state's most audacious murders.
This is graphing of the quantities of arsenic that were found in Mr. Reed's hair, and this tells us that that initial illness was a result of arsenic poisoning, but also tells us that he continued to receive arsenic while he was in the hospital.
Blanche was arrested and charged with murder. During her trial, jurors heard how Blanche killed her victim with kindness.
All evidence indicates that she was bringing poison to the hospital and disguised with or contained within some of the food that she fed him, and continued to poison him in the hospital until ultimately he died.
During her sentencing phase, the state actually argued that his murder should be viewed as a serial murder because she killed him over and over again.
And there were more suspicions.
At one point, it looked like they were going to dig up everybody in about 3 counties and test them for arsenic. Anybody that had known Blanche Taylor Moore at any time in their lives was going to be tested.
We exhumed 5 individuals. They were individuals who it was believed that Mrs. Moore had some connection with, obviously, they were deceased individuals, and there were symptoms or circumstances surrounding the death that raised the possibility of arsenic poisoning.
Traces of arsenic were found in the bodies of Blanche's first husband and her father. Although cleared of involvement with her father's death, some believe their troubled relationship set a young Blanche on a course of revenge.
We know that he was a womanizer. We know that he left the family. I think she replicated that sort of tortured relationship with the other men that she became involved with during her life.
It is not unusual that when they grow up, the problems that they had with their father, psychologically and emotionally, will spill over into their current relationships with men. They may love their husband, but as soon as things turn south or they are made angry by him, he may represent bad daddy, and he will be the target of their wrath. She may kill her father over and over and over again.
Convicted of one murder count and charged with another, Blanche Taylor Moore awaits execution on death row.
Some women believe that they are actually entitled to kill a man who cheats on them or is leaving them for another woman. This idea is frequently reinforced in writings and stories and movies and, goodness, hundreds of years back, that this was something that women were simply entitled to do.
London, 1955. And a pretty club hostess, Ruth Ellis, had no idea she was about to divide a nation and make British legal history.
Good time girl. At 19, she's running a club in the West End of London, getting people to, buy drinks at extortionate prices. And she would con people into spending and parting with a lot of money here in the club.
Ex-policeman John Ross oversees Scotland Yard's Crime Museum, where Ruth Ellis is remembered.
We collect items from famous cases and display them in the museum. The stories that go with all these cases, you learn from history. Nothing ever changes.
Moonlight and kisses, peaches and cream.
Many men fell under Ruth's spell, but only one would dominate her attention: the dashing David Blakey.
Self-centered, racing car driver, never actually going to make it, but spent all his life. Rich boy, just running around, enjoying himself. She was madly in love with him, desperately in love with him, and he wasn't with her.
But after a 2-year relationship, the suave race car driver was proving hard to tie down.
Your girl can have affairs with other women all the time. Purely self-centered, selfish man, a playboy.
Each dalliance delivered more frustration for Ruth. David's philandering didn't seem to slow down. When Ruth became pregnant with his baby, things only became worse.
He punched her in the stomach. Whether that was to get rid of the baby or it was just in one of their violent moments, you will never know. But all he did was send her a bunch of flowers the next day and said sorry. That was it. Yeah.
Ruth lost her baby and planned her revenge.
Women are much more relationship-based. They are much more into their feelings and their intuition. I feel that when women's relationships are disrupted, they can become furious.
A gun is an interesting weapon because it allows the shooter, the killer, to dispatch their victim without even getting close to them. It's all going to be over in a matter of minutes.
This is a small caliber revolver. This is classified as a low velocity handgun. In other words, the speed at which the bullet would be leaving the end of the muzzle would be less than 2,000 feet per second.
On April 10, 1955, David Blakey was drinking in the Magdala pub in North London. Ruth and her weapon were ready.
The reason this is such an effective weapon is that it doesn't take much force at all to pull the trigger. In fact, probably 2 to 3, maybe 4 pounds of pressure.
As they came out of the pub, Ruth Ellis stepped out the shadows and called his name.
David!
Fired 2 shots at him.
When a bullet enters that body, the kinetic energy will cause a cavity, something called a temporary cavity, that's caused by energy radiating out from that speeding bullet.
He just walked up and emptied the other 3 bullets into him.
When a bullet enters a body, it perforates through the skin. As it does so, it will damage blood vessels and it will cause massive internal bleeding. Blood will accumulate and the body will go into shock when it has lost approximately 20% of its circulating blood volume.
It was a very public murder. Many witnesses. In 1955, murder was a capital offense.
The problem for Ruth Ellis was she had a death wish. She'd killed the only thing she ever loved and she wanted to die.
Facing a death sentence, Ruth offered no resistance at her trial.
You know, she was actually admitted when asked about firing the bullets into David Blakey. She said, yeah, of course I went there. I went to the Magdala Public House that evening with the intention of shooting David Blakey and killing him. Now, she's admitted the premeditation, she's admitted the act. She has to be found guilty of murder.
Although many believed Ruth was driven to murder by her victim's actions, English law at the time could make no concession.
It's difficult to imagine a civilized society putting to death a killer who had a clear-cut history of abuse from the individual that they killed.
Modern laws recognizing diminished responsibility were yet to be written. Despite public protests and parliamentary petitions, 28-year-old Ruth Ellis was hanged at Holloway Prison. It would be a turning point in English justice. New laws recognizing battered woman syndrome and diminished responsibility would follow. Within 10 years, capital punishment was suspended. Ruth would be the last woman executed in England. In an undisclosed Australian city, David Kellett lives in hiding. Although he left his ex-wife many years ago, recent events make him fear for his life. his former spouse is Catherine Knight.
You can't change a psychopath, and I believe in my own heart she's a psychopathic killer and she'll never change.
In a small Australian town, Catherine and David, her first love, planned a life together.
To start with, she's the most wonderful woman I think you could wish for. So devoted, perfect mother, perfect housewife.
But Catherine's borderline personality disorder was never far from the surface.
She could snap just like a biscuit. It wouldn't take much to set her off. The slightest thing, if she made a cup of coffee and there's no water in the jug, it's just something as simple as that.
One night, a darts competition almost ended David's life.
One of the elements of borderline personality disorder is that you cannot stand abandonment. And that means if somebody says they're going to be home at 10 o'clock, you want them home at 10 o'clock. And by 10:05, you're in a rage. By 10:10, you're in a murderous rage.
And she rang about 10 o'clock and said, the pub's closed, come on home. And I said, well, the dart competition hasn't quite finished yet. I'll be home when I'm ready.
There was an insult to the core when he said, I'll be home from the pub shortly. She took that as the same as being stabbed in the heart, as total rejection. And the way to make herself feel better is to exact revenge.
When somebody's getting stressed, it's usually a reaction that comes down to fear. Fear causes the release of adrenaline or epinephrine. So the heart would start beating more rapidly. Somebody would start breathing more quickly. There would be that fight or flight reaction.
David Kellett was coming home to a biochemical maelstrom.
She'd hit me so hard on the back of the head that my eyes went black. I woke up 2 days later in a hospital. Spent all my clothes in the bathtub, everything I owned, every bit of clothing she'd burnt in the bathtub.
And when the fury subsided, the caring Catherine returned.
A couple of days later, after being released from hospital, she went and bought me all brand new clothes. It was just like the type of person she was.
But there was something more frightening than Catherine's moods. A slaughterhouse worker, she brought her tools home to hang above the marital bed.
The knives were hanging on the wall. I had put a special hook there so she could hang the knives, and no one touched the knives. Her knives were the most treasured item that God ever gave to her.
We are drawn to certain jobs, hobbies, vocations, avocations, because of inner needs. My guess is that she was drawn to work in a profession that allowed her to have access and use of knives on a daily basis because that was something that she found interesting, something that met some deep-seated need.
She was just totally and absolutely possessed by knives. They were her life.
Catherine's obsession had a name.
Picarism, which is a clinical term, someone that is aroused or finds pleasure in the idea of cutting, slicing, and stabbing skin. The image in the individual's mind of the knife piercing skin is pleasant for them or even arousing.
Catherine's fascination with blades and her violent moods were on a collision course. The warning signs were enough for David Kellett. He left Catherine after 10 years. John Price wouldn't be so lucky. a killer's troubling behavior can alert potential victims. But for some unfortunate citizens of Vienna, Austria, there were no such clues. The motivation was obscure, the location unusual, the perpetrators unexpected.
This was a shock around the world, what really happened here in Vienna.
Max Edelbacher heads criminal investigations in Vienna's South District. In 1989, he and his team were called to the Lyons General Hospital.
This is one of the largest hospitals, especially dealing with very elder people.
In the preceding 3 years, an alarming number of elderly patients were dying in just one wing, Pavilion 5. Investigators soon found out why.
It's so terrible because you never would expect in a hospital that this is a murder station. No?
Angels of death. Nurses who kill patients. Usually act alone and never tell anyone. Not so in this case.
Angels of death are often motivated by sympathy for their victims or a lust for attention. In Pavilion 5, the motivation was very different.
There was a lot of stress, a lot of overwork for these nurses. And in this time, in 88 and 89, more than 60 to 65 people were in one room. And in the night shift, only 2 nurses could care for these people.
Nicht schon wieder.
Elderly patients were demanding. Too demanding.
They have an alarm next to their bed, and they were using this alarm each 5 or 10 minutes.
For one group of nurses, the solution was eternal silence.
And they became angry, and then they started to select such persons who were really active in calling them.
Ringleader Gertrude Wagner and 3 others had a pact made even crueler by their methods. In Vienna, Austria, forensic scientist Professor Johann Mislewitz would uncover one of his country's worst serial murders and the unusual murder weapon, water.
A little push was sufficient to put them to test to obstruct the breathing mechanism.
The nurses were drowning their patients.
Well, they brought the victim into a comfortable position for them. They pressed the tank down with a spatula and poured the water into the airways.
Drowning is a form of asphyxia. There will be an initial shock and an attempt to hold one's breath. When they can no longer hold it, they're going to exhale that breath and inhale water. That is going to be incredibly uncomfortable.
They say about 45 to 60 minutes it took the patients to die. They started to groan, they flattened their breathing, they became pale gray, and after about an hour they were dead.
The technique should have defied suspicion. Many patients already suffered from pulmonary edema, fluid in the lungs.
That was assumed by them that they could get away with it because you can't distinguish between liquid from pulmonary edema and liquid from tap water.
For almost 3 years, they did get away with it, and with other methods, overdoses of insulin and sedatives.
Then they became like sisters of death, and they became more and more safe in their relationship because nothing happened. There were the kings and queens. They decided about life and death.
Although the nurses would cite their motivation as frustration, the scale and daring suggests another factor to criminal profiler Candace DeLong.
I think what it has to do is the risk. Can I do this horrible thing? Can I cross this line society says if I cross, it's all over for me, right in front of other people and get away with it? And that thrill, that extra risk, is why they do it.
The killing might have continued had the nurses not been so proud.
Bragging is a common behavior that we see on the part of serial killers, in particular sadistic serial killers. And in particular, when you have a group of them together, they're proud of what they do.
A witness overheard their boasting and reported to police. When questioned, 2 of the nurses confessed.
This was very interesting with these 2 ladies, Wagner and Gruber. It was like falling stones from their shoulders or their body. They wanted to speak.
Police and hospital administrators could scarcely believe the magnitude of the murders.
At first, nobody wanted to accept that the problem could be so large. That the police had to investigate more than 300 cases.
Exhumations and postmortems were difficult. Evidence of drowning often lost to decomposition. But enough was collected to prove 38 cases of homicide, with many other cases indeterminable.
This was extreme. In America and in some other continents, we had such cases that nurses killed somebody, but I think this was one of the largest cases worldwide. And this was a shock around the world, what really happened here in Vienna.
And just as rare, 4 angels of death working together.
There have been cases of murder in hospital before concerning hospital personnel, but only in this case there were 4 people knowing each other.
Nurses Waltraud Wagner and Irina Leidolf were convicted of multiple murders. They served life sentences. The other 2 were convicted of manslaughter and attempted murder and sentenced for 15 years. In small-town Australia, Catherine Knight was brewing her own personal storm. Her target, fiancé John Price. Catherine's ex-husband, David Kellett, knew John was playing a dangerous game.
John Price was a good bloke. I'd only met him the once, but I found him to be very sincere and very scared. I believe he broke off the engagement, and I believe Kathy couldn't stand to be left alone again.
Catherine's borderline personality disorder had proven too much. John asked her to leave, as he had done several times before. But this would be the last. Catherine would end their arguments forever.
The video that Catherine made the day she killed John Price is much like the other videos in her collection. She drove to her daughter's place to film the grandchild, and there's some beautiful footage of Catherine playing with this little baby on the ground. And then there's a moment when Catherine addresses the camera and says, "I love my grandchildren. I hope I will see you all again." And it's as if she's making a last will and testament. This was a signal, a definite signal that she was going to kill John that night and that her life was not going to be the same the next morning.
On the morning of March 1st, 2000, Detective Sergeant Bob Wells was called to John Price's address.
It's still something that has a great effect on me today. It's something I'm still trying to come to grips with even today, emotionally and mentally.
Catherine's fury created a crime scene unlike any in Australian history.
I think upon walking into that particular crime scene, it was horrific carnage that was throughout that house from one end to the other. Had almost anybody who went into the house that day in sort of a feeling of numbness for quite some time before they came to actually register what had actually happened, you know.
Catherine had been to work with her knives.
He was stabbed approximately 37 times, about the body. Information from the forensic people were that one of those blows was a fatal blow to the heart, which eventually was the cause of death.
One well-placed stab is all that's necessary to kill someone. 37 indicates to me a lot of anger, and probably a number of those stab wounds were post-mortem. Just couldn't stop killing him.
But Catherine's revenge would go further, much further.
The murder was ritualistic. Catherine went out that day, she prepared for it. She went to the welfare shop and she bought a black nightie, a sexy black nightie with buttons down the front. She went to his house late.
While visiting her estranged partner, Catherine stabbed him 37 times. She did not stop there.
And at some stage, something clicked in Catherine's mind. She'd had her initial revenge, and then I think she decided she wanted to have some fun. She went back to the life she loved, to cutting up animals and carcasses and that sort of business.
Catherine had been cooking, as she had almost every day, preparing an evening meal of meat and vegetables. When police arrived at the crime scene, they found a pot still warm on the stove and 2 meals waiting on the table. In horror, Detective Sergeant Bob Wells realized that the meal was made from her former partner, John Price.
I really think at the time it was hard for me to say, well, how could any human do that to any other human?
I cried for days, in bed, out of bed, walking around, just to think what she'd done.
Catherine was found asleep in bed. She'd unsuccessfully tried to overdose on prescription drugs. The storm had passed.
This is dreadful, gruesome, horrible behavior that we rarely see. We see it, but it's not very common.
These deadly women were united by a vortex of revenge. But its source is as varied as their crimes. Blanche Taylor Moore.
Her father was a gambler and a womanizer, and he so totally abandoned them that they never even heard from him again.
This woman was abused, abandoned, neglected by the most important man in her life, a father.
She had relationships with men that were doomed from the beginning. She chose men with whom she could not form a stable relationship.
And when it happened again, she just absolutely could not help herself, and it was an urge that she chose to give into.
Ruth Ellis.
10 days before she shot him, she had a miscarriage. Maybe, just perhaps, the lady's mind is not going to be 100%.
Getting away with it, that wasn't as important to her as, I'll show you, watch this, you can't do this to me. Taking his life far exceeded the need to get away with it.
The Austrian nurses.
The starting point was this terrible working situation. But then they became like sisters of death. More and more they felt this power over life and death.
Serial killers have told us that although their first killing wasn't something that they equated with power, that oftentimes into their 4th and 14th and 50th killing, that the motivation was to let the person keep their life or to take their life from them. A God trip, if you will, playing God over someone's life.
And Catherine Knight.
Her father had a stick above a hallway. It was called the killing stick. And he would flog his children, absolutely flog them on the head, the arms, body, wouldn't matter where, and just totally just flog them.
I think it was a built-up anger over years of failed relationships, and got to the point where she just couldn't go on any longer, and the fact that she might face rejection by another partner again drove her to the point of where she just lost control.
Just because she was a butcher doesn't mean she decided to do these horrible things. She became a butcher because she had an interest in cutting, slicing, and doing those kinds of things. My guess is she had feelings and thoughts and desires to do those kinds of things, the things she did to him post-mortem when she was a young girl.
The court found Catherine to be of sound mind when she butchered John Price. She serves a life sentence.
Everybody has to be forgiven, but you can't forgive what she really did to those men.
These are the stories of terrible deeds.
They would choose 2 or 3 victims a year and simply kill them.
Of crimes written in blood on history's pages.
She was just a conveyor belt of bodies coming in and out of there.
Across time and across continents, something united these murderers.
What they did was unforgivable, but they were clever.
They shared a common ambition.
She understood her market for death very thoroughly.
They wanted money.
Greed can become a monster that feeds on itself.
And would do anything to get it.
Even when they came here and didn't intend to spend the night, they stayed, and they went back and got their money and came back.
The business of deadly women.
Money makes people do all kinds of things. Female prophet killers tend to be very methodical. They plan out their crimes very well. Put a lot of thought into it and how they're gonna do it. How they're gonna get rid of the evidence. What stories are they gonna tell? Quite a bit goes into it. Oftentimes they're killing people close to them and they don't get caught for years.
In a remote field in Norway stands a silent reminder of a deadly woman.
It's not to celebrate her, but to mark where one of the worst female mass murders in the world was born.
For a century, residents of the small village of Selbu have lived in the shadow of their infamous resident, Belganes. Headmaster Torget Storseth has two great passions. One is teaching, the other his search for the truth behind the Norwegian serial killer.
My father told me the story about Belganes. She was clever at school, but she might be characterized as an outsider among the children. So it might be an illustration that she was easily angered.
In the late 19th century, an angry young woman left the chill of Norway for a new life in America's Midwest.
Well, a lot of Norwegians went to America. We were a poor, poor country, and they went to seek their fortune, seek new opportunities.
Torget has come to LaPorte, Indiana, to solve the mystery preoccupying his village to this day.
Well, they are curious, I think. How could a woman from our area become one of the worst female serial killers in the world? Hello.
Welcome to LaPorte County Historical Society.
Thank you.
Good to see you.
Author Sylvia Shepard has chronicled Bell's crimes and is anxious to share notes with a fellow seeker from Bell's hometown.
It's been said that she probably killed in the 40s, close to 40.
The pair meet at the local museum, where some of Bell's handiwork is kept.
I understand that it is Scandinavian because I had an archaeologist look at it, and he said from the forehead and the way that it's shaped that it was indeed Scandinavian.
The skull's identity is unknown.
And right here it even says, found in the outhouse at the Gunnis farm.
It could be any of the lonely men who strayed into Bell's trap.
She wanted Norwegian men, so she advertised in a Norwegian newspaper called the Scandinavian. See, many of these men had come over from Norway, and they wanted a woman, a wife, you know, somebody, companion.
Bell was a good catch. She had profited from a string of insurance claims. She'd lost a candy store to fire. and 2 husbands in suspicious circumstances.
Belle had 48 acres here. Chickens, pigs. You know, she advertised and said that she had all this. And she did have all that. She just didn't include what she did with the people. She had an allure. Many men came and thought they weren't going to be staying, but they did.
In 1908, one victim to fall for Belle was Norwegian Andrew Helgeline.
He was just one of those people that answered one of her ads.
Convinced his future would be here with Belle, Andrew surrendered his life savings, $3,000.
She kept men here even when they came here and didn't intend to spend the night, or they stayed and they went back and got their money and came back.
By the time Andrew Helgeline settled in LaPorte, Belle had 3 foster children to raise. The farm's income was modest, so her new man's savings were a windfall. But this homely scene was a prelude to death.
Female serial killers frequently use poison as their weapon.
Former FBI criminal profiler Candace DeLong, with 20 years' experience, recognizes Belle's business plan.
They don't have to get close to the victim, they just have to get close to their food. And strychnine is something that one would expect to see on a farm.
Strychnine was commonly used as rat poison.
Strychnine is a phenomenal compound. It comes from the seed of a tree in India.
Forensic pathologist Dr. Janice Amatuzio, based in Coon Rapids, Minnesota, knows strychnine's inevitable result.
It antagonizes or stops the inhibitory reflex, so that all of the reflexes of the stronger muscles, the flexor muscles, are exaggerated. What an individual who takes strychnine will feel is initially perhaps a sense of anxiety or nervousness. Then they'll notice muscle twitches and muscle spasms. And then they actually get into almost a seizure-like state where they have convulsions. These contractions are painful. And the victim is conscious throughout this whole process and probably terrified.
It would take 2 types of people to be able to watch that. A sadist would probably enjoy it, or a cold-hearted individual for whom killing was no big deal. The greater gain, getting their money, was worth whatever they had to do to get it.
But Belle's treachery would go much further. It would rank among the most grisly crimes in Indiana's history. In the 1880s, in Liverpool, England, a group of women ran an extraordinary cooperative.
I think everyone is familiar with the concept of women sticking together in times of trouble, but you normally assume that it's going to be a helping in a pleasant way.
Retired police prosecutor Angela Braben spent a lifetime fighting crime in English courts. But the case that fascinates her most happened before she was born.
You've got a group of women living together and they're forming a web, a syndicate of murder. And they're investing in death.
The plan was simple. Insure everyone in their immediate acquaintance, then kill them one by one.
There were 4 women who were actually killing. And then there were 5 or 6 others who were concerning themselves solely with the insurance.
The women's cunning netted them a small fortune and turned the British insurance industry upside down.
I admire them in a strange sort of way. They worked out the insurance rates, how would they get the best rates for different people. They knew all the rules and regulations of the insurance and burial clubs, virtually backwards as far as I could work out.
Together, they formed a predator pack. More common among male perpetrators, the female pack can be just as formidable.
The pack mentality can certainly take over in a situation where you have a number of perpetrators with a common goal, to obtain money. That money makes people do all kinds of things.
No one was spared. Siblings, husbands, strangers. Like young boarder Maggie Jennings.
There's probably one person in the group that's the leader, the alpha female. The one who came up with the idea, who drew up the plans, who gave the orders, and everybody else pretty much followed in line.
In Liverpool, the pack's leader was Catherine Flanagan. Second in command, her sister, Margaret Higgins. Their method? Poison.
Arsenic obtained from flypapers. It was very readily available. All little shops would have the flypapers. You'd soak them in water and obtain a liquid, which then could very easily be added to the food. And women being the ones who provide the food, they could mix what they wished.
Chronic ingestion of small amounts of arsenic gives very unusual symptoms. It might be the onset of intermittent abdominal pain, diarrhea, numbness and tingling in the extremities.
Arsenic was not only easily available to the Liverpool sisterhood, its symptoms were much like common illnesses of Victorian England.
The slums of Liverpool at the time would have been hideous places. There was no public sanitation. There wasn't running water. People were crowded into small areas, and disease is a very natural outcome to those circumstances.
No suspicions were raised when victims like Maggie Jennings died in the prime of life.
The doctors were expecting to find the diseases of poverty, malnutrition, and insanitary conditions. The women, therefore, made sure that the doctors found something that would fit with what the doctors were expecting.
With every death came an insurance payout to one of the group, to be later shared.
Maggie Jennings, for example, was insured for over £112, and those insurances were started approximately 12 months before she died. So that was a very good rate of return for an investment.
A good return indeed, when a laborer's weekly wage was less than £1, not even a couple of dollars. With premiums of just a few pennies a month, unscrupulous citizens could use England's life insurance companies for murderous gain.
The insurance man would go from house to house and penny here and twopence there. And overall, one must assume that the insurance companies made a profit. But I suspect that in this particular area of Liverpool, they probably made a loss.
The women in the Liverpool syndicate were illiterate, but that didn't hinder business. Insurance brokers at the time were eager to sign up customers for their own commissions.
They would be paid 1 year's premiums as their commission. So obviously the more people they could be encouraged to insure, the better. And if somebody was not sure about the right answers, they would make the answers up as they went along.
This confluence of poison, poor hygiene, and exuberant sales pitches created the perfect storm of murder.
Victims were chosen depending on how old they were they ill? Could they be hastened? Could they get insurance for them? And if so, how much? And they would choose 2 or 3 victims a year and simply kill them.
Greed can become a monster that feeds on itself. And it's one of the toughest things in the world to keep a lid on.
The Liverpool syndicate operated undetected for at least 4 years. Their final tally would shock the country.
It's very complicated to explain who killed who. And so this is a little diagram which shows you've got the 2 sisters here. Certainly they killed Thomas Higgins, that's one husband gone. They probably killed the other husband, John Flanagan, as well. They certainly killed a son, a daughter-in-law, daughter-in-law's mother, a lodger, a little stepdaughter of 12, neighbours, friends, anyone else really that they could get their hands on.
It's believed the syndicate murdered at least 17 people for profit. If there was any remorse, it seemed lost in a web of shared liability.
In a gang or a pack committing a crime, whether it's one crime or several ongoing crimes, the sense of guilt, if there is any, is definitely shared. And it's something that one member of the group can take some kind of comfort in knowing, well, I didn't really do this alone. I was the group. The power of the group can be very, very strong.
In 1883, after 4 years, the group's power was finally extinguished. A suspicious relative convinced authorities to test the body of Margaret's husband. Police found arsenic, then pieced together a long trail of death. Enough evidence was found to convict Catherine Flanagan and her sister Margaret Higgins. Newspaper reports describe how they hung side by side from the gallows. The others escaped prosecution. A shocked government clamped down on insurance practices, fearing the Liverpool syndicate was just part of a poison epidemic.
The effect on the government was like dynamite, because they realized that this was not a very small scale murder confined to one area of one city. They realized that it was probably happening all over the country in similar areas.
Just as shocking to the English public was the fact the Liverpool women could kill those near and dear to them, even a child. In LaPorte, Indiana, Belle Gunness seems to have shared that chilling facility. Belle's story took a mysterious twist one spring evening.
There was a handyman that was in that house, and when he went to bed that night, the occupants of the house were Belle and 3 children. The fire began at about 4 o'clock in the morning.
The Gunness farm was razed, its occupants consumed. The only survivor, Belle's handyman.
When they got down through the ashes into the basement, there were 4 bodies there, 3 children and a female.
And there was more. Investigating the fire scene, workers noticed soft spots around the farm and began to dig.
they would find all of the victims wrapped in gunny sacks, parts of them. They had been all dismembered, fit into these sacks with lime. There were children that were in her care, and of course the men who came to visit her and never got away.
Among the victims would be Andrew Helgeline, the partner wooed from Norway.
They found him in a garbage pit where Bell had carried garbage, fish heads, tomato cans. It smelled terrible. That was the excuse for the smell.
Other human bones suggest the Gunness farm pigs helped conceal further victims.
I think the fact that Bell threw the body parts of her victims into a pig trough is a pretty good indicator as to the type of person that she was, how she felt about these men that she killed. What kind of final send-off is that for someone that was a human being to throw their body parts in a pig trough? Well, that's the kind of person she was. She didn't care. That's where she thought they belonged.
Altogether, 14 bodies were found, including Bell's foster children.
Probably she had given poison to her 3 children and killed them. Maybe with a hammer blow too, because there was found holes in their skull after the fire. How could a mother do a thing like that?
There's another mystery. Did Bell perish in the fire? The only adult female body left few clues.
At that time, they thought it was Bell dead in the fire.
But the body was smaller than Bell's. And inexplicably, the skeleton was headless.
There is no logic to the fact that there were her children's skeletons intact, and then the one adult skeleton, which one would think would be hers, the head is missing. And the head, of course, would be the one part of a skeleton that would have the most identifiers.
Was this just another of Bell's insurance scams? Torgette's search for the truth is not yet over. As any business person knows, if you can match service with customer need, there's opportunity for profit. For Amy Archer Gilligan, that opportunity came with the elderly.
Amy Archer Gilligan presented herself to the world as this very innocent Christian woman, projecting this veil of just a caretaker who wanted to take care of the sick and make a living at it.
Investigative journalist M. William Phelps believes Amy's customers were sold the perfect pitch.
You know, in today's economy, today's marketing, she would have been an expert marketer. What she should have had was a sign out front, really, that said, elderly care for life, as long as you don't die first.
In 1907, in Connecticut, Amy was ahead of her time, launching one of New England's first nursing homes.
She was a pioneer of elderly care at the turn of the century in New England. She kind of pioneered this whole idea of nursing elderly people, which later turns into convalescent homes, this kind of thing.
Seniors like Franklin Andrews signed up for a peaceful, caring home in which to spend their twilight years.
The marketing ploy was $1,000, and I give your relative, your elderly person, life care. And life care meant they stayed in the home, she took care of them, fed them, clothed them, gave them medicines.
There was no time limit. As long as the customers lived, Amy promised to care for them.
You know, it seemed too good to be true, and people lined up.
Clients and their families hoped for a long and restful life. But Amy's business plan called for something else. Turnover.
Let's set the scene. Picture a calm and peaceful New England night. Patients are readying themselves for bed. They've just finished dinner. You have Amy Archer Gilligan in the kitchen mixing up a batch of warm lemonade. And warm lemonade at the time was an elixir for if you had the flu or you had an ailment.
Amy kept her overheads down and vacancies up with arsenic.
She understood her market for death very thoroughly. Her whole marketing genius was get the person in there, let them stay there for maybe a month, knock them off, and she's got $1,000 in her pocket. It sure beats changing bedpans for a living.
Amy's calculations went further. To conceal evidence of her poisoning, she counted on an old mortuary practice.
Well, basically, embalming fluids were preservatives, and they contained alcohols, formaldehyde, and they often contained a number of heavy metals like arsenic. Embalming, of course, being done prior to any post-mortem examination or prior to any specimens being taken for toxicology.
Amy had a near-perfect cover. Elderly clients were expected to die, sooner rather than later. And if there were any suspicions, forensic tests would be contaminated.
Amy was very good at marketing and business. She would sell a bed to the patient, kill them, and probably have someone lined up to take that bed before that patient even was taken to the morgue.
They dubbed it a murder factory because she was just a conveyor belt of bodies coming in and out of there.
But Amy's business plan had a fatal flaw. Medical records of the time may have misrecorded the cause of death, but they could not hide the number dying under Amy's care.
The returns of death certificates to the office of the Windsor Town Clerk show that there have been 60 deaths at the Archer home since the place opened in the fall of 1907.
Over time, a case mounted against Amy Archer Gilligan, but police needed evidence.
They had a lot of circumstantial evidence that they were beginning to incorporate some forensic evidence of doing some exhumations into it.
Franklin Andrews' body was exhumed and tested positive for arsenic. No surprise for an embalmed body of the day, but there was one anomaly.
Well, they found his stomach loaded with arsenic. Enough to kill several men. That was the quote.
Such levels could only have come from ingestion.
Right here, the Hartford Courant reports, it is the belief of the authorities that the wholesale murders have been committed at the Archer home.
Amy was convicted of murder and declared insane. She spent the rest of her life in an asylum. By the time she died, arsenic embalming fluid was banned. Justice should have caught up with Norwegian serial murderer Belle Gunness in Indiana. But did it? By 1908, Belle's American adventure had come to a grisly end. 14 bodies were found on her farm, many chopped into pieces. Townsfolk were desperate to know what happened.
Welcome to LaPorte, Indiana.
Thank you very much.
And the Circuit Court.
The Belle Gunness case is something that is probably a major part of the history of this whole town.
Judge Robert Gilmore's predecessor presided over LaPorte's most infamous trial.
The skeletons were in somewhat of a fetal position, somewhat clenched.
The fire's heat might explain it, but skeletons buried beyond the flames were also contorted.
And then the argument became whether or not it may have been strychnine that caused the bodies to clench and get into the fetal position.
Strychnine, basically what it does is it causes the stronger muscles to overcome the weaker muscles. So the hand will flex at the wrist, the arm will flex at the elbow, and the elbow will flex at the shoulder. And likewise, the legs. The legs will contract and flex in a position such as this.
Strychnine was confirmed in the stomach of Norwegian lodger Andrew Helgeline. Bell was exposed as a murderer. But there was one more mystery. Did the serial killer perish?
The whole trial centered around whether or not, in fact, it was the body of Belle Gunness that they found in the remains of the fire, or whether, in fact, it may have been some other third party, we know not who.
In this courtroom in 1908, jurors heard how the headless body seemed too small for Belle's large frame. One theory was the fire had shrunk the body.
Well, you know, they tried to say that just like a roast, this body cooked up and got skinny then, you know, skinnier than Belle was. But the children were still the same size. And their heads were all down there.
Despite conflicting evidence, jurors found the headless body was Belle Gunness, but many believed otherwise. And 23 years later, there was one more twist. For 3 decades, Ellen Penny has kept a secret.
I remember every little detail about everything to do with this. Always have. Because I've relived it all my life. Over and over.
Today, she wouldn't change her loving family for the world. But in 1967, her dreams were elsewhere.
We may have gone on and got married like we thought we would, but he didn't get that chance. And not because God chose to take him, but because his mama did.
At 15, Ellen was falling in love for the very first time with 16-year-old Melvin Gibbs. The affair bloomed under the watchful eye of Melvin's mother, Janie.
She was big in the church, and she was big in all of the activities.
But their love would be cut short by murder. Janie's 3 sons had already lost their father to a mystery illness. And it seemed Melvin could be next.
He started having bad headaches. He would turn real pale, and his features would look drawn, and the whites of his eyes would get real, real red. He was never one to make a big deal out of it. And I'd say, "You have a bad headache, don't you?" And he'd say, "Yeah." But they started getting a lot more frequent.
Melvin's constant headaches didn't stop his blossoming relationship with Ellen.
Melvin gave me a surprise birthday party, my last birthday before he died. I was given this diary.
But the lovebirds' future would be confined to a box of memories. Melvin's headaches became worse. Doctors were perplexed. Janie was not. She was poisoning her son with mild doses of arsenic.
If it's given over a period of time, individuals will have a variety of symptoms, and the doctors won't diagnose it unless they think of it. They are very slowly being killed while the medical community, the physicians, are just watching to see what happens.
Only 2 people knew the true story, Janie and her son.
And just as I got to the door, I heard Melvin holler, "You did it. You did it." And Melvin was sitting up in the bed, looking right at her. And his pillow was laying on the floor in front of her. And then said, "Did you hear that? Did you see what he did?" And she said, "I don't know what it is I'm supposed to have done."
Melvin's outbursts were put down to delirium. But soon he would be silenced, right under his doctor's noses.
She went to the little pitcher of water they always have in the hospital room and poured that water out and poured hers in. She said, but the water there had too much sulfur in it, it burned his throat.
In a cruel twist, Janie deceives her son's sweetheart into the final act.
As she had kept saying, "Ellen, give him some more water, give him some more water. His throat's dry, give him some more water."
That water, Ellen now realizes, was laced with arsenic.
I was there with my hand on him, and you could feel his heartbeat. And then just all of a sudden, nothing, just completely stopped. I don't really blame myself. But I think that she got some kind of perverse pleasure.
Melvin's life insurance paid handsomely, as would policies on every other member of Janie's family. Her husband, 3 sons, and a grandson. All would die of a mystery illness. With each life insurance policy collected, Janie Gibbs's lifestyle improved.
Afterwards, you hardly ever saw her in the same dress twice. She bought a new car, bought a house.
Janie also shared her gains.
We were building a new church, and I was told she donated $10,000, but she donated different amounts at different times.
Donating the large sum of money to the church may have been a way to assuage her guilt, if she had any guilt, and it simply could have been a very calculating move to not be suspected of anything.
But as her family died around her, people were suspicious.
I think there was a lot of people that were starting to be suspicious, but if you're wrong, you know, this is Janie Gibbs, she's the pillar of the church. And what kind of monster are you for making an accusation like that against her?
But 5 deaths in the one family proved too much for police. They exhumed the bodies for testing.
Well, what we're looking at is the autopsy report on Melvin Gibbs, and this was performed on January 18th, 1968, and it happens to have been an exhumation autopsy. Now, it's important to realize that in some individuals, there will be a very minute amount of arsenic, just normally found in tissues. What was found in his liver and kidney was at least 20 times the amount normally found. The levels here are sufficient to have caused death.
Janie was convicted on 5 counts of murder and sentenced to life. But there would be one more discovery, making Janie's murders an even greater family tragedy.
And this is the greatest tragedy. This is on par with the deaths of the people.
Frank Martin was Janie Gibbs's defense lawyer. He believes his client's motivation was not for profit. He learned that before she murdered her family, Janie had a fateful appointment.
Janie had gone to a doctor in Albany, Georgia, because she wasn't feeling well. The doctor diagnosed her with Lou Gehrig's disease.
Lou Gehrig's disease destroys muscle control. It's always fatal.
Janie went back home with her very fundamentalist beliefs. She decided she would send her husband, her children and grandchildren on to heaven in advance, because she knew she was going to die, and she was just going to send them ahead so they'd all be reunited in heaven.
In LaPorte, Indiana, the crimes of Belle Gunness paid handsomely.
When they tried to tally up how much money she might have gotten, because this was all about money, they thought it was probably close to $52,000, which would have been hundreds of thousands today. We're standing at the grave of Andrew Helgeline. He was the last male victim that Belle killed here.
As Norwegian Torget Sturset pays respect to his countrymen, he struggles to find forgiveness.
Everybody has to be forgiven, but you can't forgive what she really did to those men. She had to be sick or mentally ill in a way, I don't know.
I think there was a lot more motivating Belle than simply money. And I think that's exhibited in the method of death that she chose, a painful poisoning. Then, chopping up their bodies and throwing the body parts into a pig trough shows utter contentment for men. I would say it was men in general she had a problem with.
Maybe hated men because the father abandoned her, as the rumor says.
Torget still has questions. The biggest of all, was Belle really killed in the farm fire?
There was a real division within the community as to whether or not she died in the fire or whether she escaped and basically was on the run.
I absolutely believe that she escaped. The head was never found to that female body. She had a whole week to get away between the time when the fire was discovered and then the first body in the ground was discovered.
23 years later, a local newspaper speculated that this Californian murderer, fitting Belle's projected age, could be her.
Then they sent a picture back here, taken in a very strange pose with her hands like this. Well, why would you take a picture that way? I think that's why she did it. She's clever.
If Belle did feign her death, there could well have been more victims.
It is unlikely that her murderous behavior would stop. Being a fairly young woman at the time, less than 50, she was into it. So I'm guessing she simply relocated and resumed her activities elsewhere.
Many in the Liverpool syndicate survived prosecution, but new insurance laws put an end to their business.
I think that this case resulted in a lot of the policies that we see today. For example, if I was running a boarding house, renting out rooms, I could not get a life insurance policy on the guy that I'm renting out to room 103. I have no what's called insurable interest in him. Someone has to have an insurable interest in an individual now to get a life insurance policy, and the individual being insured has to sign for the policy.
Amy Archer Gilligan left a legacy too, helping create nursing homes, now a common concept across the United States.
You know, when you look at Amy Archer Gilligan from the outside, she was really an entrepreneur of her day. She really was. But when you look beyond that and you look at the facts and the evidence, you see someone who was shrouded with evil.
On the face of it, they killed for money, for economic survival, or handsome profits. But for criminal profiler Candice DeLong, there was probably something more.
One of the things that always comes to my mind when we are looking at female serial killers who say they just did it for the money, I have to ask myself if they weren't also enjoying the killing, because it becomes what almost appears to be a compulsive behavior. Again and again and again, doing something as serious, the most serious behavior in our society, criminal behavior, taking someone's life.
For Janie Gibbs, the compulsion to consign her family to heaven proved doubly tragic. After all the killing, Janie learned her doctor's diagnosis was wrong. She wasn't fatally ill. Instead of heaven, Janie went into custody, where she remained for nearly 40 years.
How did she turn into this woman who would, by her own hands, do things that are hardly fit to tell?
These are the stories of terrible deeds.
She was probably the most unique female serial killer that I came across.
Of crimes written in blood on history's pages.
Seasoned firemen fell to their knees from the stench of death inside the room.
Across time and across continents, something united these murderers.
I think Dr. Hazard was a serial killer, and a sadistic one at that.
Apparently that's where she performed autopsies, in that bathtub.
Something more than wicked determination.
She was one of the worst killers of all time. It was possible for her to get away with anything.
Something more than menacing minds.
This is almost a museum of death of her own design.
The answer lies behind the masks of deadly women.
Those stories tell us who we are as people and what our dark side is. My grandfather made veiled references to an evil person who had been in the family. The family did not want to talk about Elizabeth. They just knew this was a bad person.
Dennis Bathory Kitts is a haunted man. The comfort of his home in Vermont can't shelter him from the horrors performed in his family name more than 400 years ago.
I struggle with what the Countess did all the time, in part because I've built a website about the Countess and I get a lot of very, very hostile email. And I begin to realize how much this has cascaded down through the centuries.
Countess Elizabeth Bathory was a Hungarian noblewoman at the turn of the 17th century.
She was cousin to the king of Hungary, of Transylvania, considered the most beautiful woman in the realm. Educated, brilliant, trilingual, a woman whose castles formed a line between west and east.
A diplomat, the Countess negotiated treaties between these two great empires. But by night, another creature emerged. The Countess of Blood.
There is evidence that hundreds of servants went to that castle and never came back.
It's believed Elizabeth was one of the world's worst serial killers, murdering perhaps 600 of her servants.
The numbers are astounding until you do the math. And if you think of the fact that she lived into her 50s and probably began this as a teenager, so she had 40 years to kill 600 of her servants.
Let's say, for the sake of argument, that she only killed 10% of what she's rumored to have killed.
In all her career, FBI profiler Candice DeLong has never encountered murder on such a scale.
60. And that would still make her one of the most prolific serial killers in the history of the world.
Elizabeth's personal death toll dwarfs any in modern crime. Even more disturbing is why she murdered.
There is a tale that this began because the blood fell on her skin when she was hitting a servant, and she thought that it made that skin younger.
Elizabeth believed blood would preserve her youth and beauty. In a macabre prologue to the fictitious Count Dracula from nearby Transylvania, the Countess drank her victim's blood. But unlike Dracula, Elizabeth was cruel fact.
Vampirism is a clinical term used by psychiatrists throughout the world. It is a behavior of consuming blood.
For criminal profiler Candice DeLong, this bizarre ritual is not unique to the environs of Transylvania.
I'm aware of cases in the United States, one very recent and one 30 years old, in which the individuals, both males, killed people for the sole purpose of consuming their blood.
Perhaps it was wanting some sort of youth from these young people. Perhaps it was just some sort of a mental defect that did not translate to the rest of her life.
Dennis is consumed by his ancestor. He gives blood as symbolic compensation and is driven to unearth the reasons for Elizabeth's evil.
How did she turn into this woman who would, by her own hands, do things that are hardly fit to tell? What can you say about this kind of behavior?
Modern science may have an answer to Dennis's painful question.
You see, before women began taking iron replacement therapy, they would lose iron each month with their menstrual period. And so many women were iron deficient. And when you're iron deficient, your hemoglobin level drops.
Forensic pathologist and county coroner Dr. Janice Amatuzio knows the human body's secrets. For 20 years, she's examined the dead, bringing their stories to life.
Blood is a real phenomenal source of iron. Perhaps she thought it would make her look more vibrant or younger because perhaps she was iron deficient. By drinking this blood, she got a rosy glow to her cheeks because she finally got her hemoglobin up to the level it was at.
Was the blood countess self-medicating for anemia? It's something Dennis had never considered. But he thinks there must be more behind the terrible crimes of his ancestor.
She bit her victims. She would bite their flesh.
What could turn a noblewoman into a vampire?
Those stories tell us who we are as people and what our dark side is.
Dennis is determined to find out. The dark side of human nature also fascinated Michael Kelleher until he learned too much.
I've spent so many years dealing with so many violent people that I want my later years to be part of the natural process of what it is to be human.
The author and former profiler now searches for peace.
And that involves nature. It doesn't lie. It doesn't manipulate. It accepts everything. And it's part of who we are.
While working on his book, Murder Most Rare, Michael came as close as he dared to a host of deadly women.
My original interest in female serial killers came from the misguided perception in the United States that there weren't any, or that there was at most one, which to me seemed inconceivable. So found nearly 100 since 1900, both in the United States and out, and stopped at that number.
The killer intriguing him most is Vera Renzi.
She was probably the most unique female serial killer that I came across. She was clearly intelligent. She had resources. She murdered in her own home. She controlled the environment in which she killed for years and years. The daughter of a very well-to-do family, a pretty girl, but a wild girl, who wound up being, well, I don't know how to put this delicately, one heck of an efficient serial killer.
In the 1930s in Bucharest, Hungary, Vera Renzi murdered her lovers. Each and every one of them. After 2 failed marriages, the beautiful Vera invited a long line of suitors.
She allures, she draws this male in. And this wouldn't be happenstance. This male would be selected by her. And she would use her allure, her tacit beauty, her money, her sophistication to draw him in a sexual way.
Vera chose married men.
This would be his last night on Earth. His dinner would be well seasoned with something not to his liking that would kill him.
Vera's seductive dinners were laced with arsenic.
Arsenic is a popular method of poisoning that we've seen throughout the centuries.
What will happen? The individuals who take it, first of all, will begin to feel sick. Arsenic causes a disruption of the membranes of the stomach, something called hemorrhagic, meaning blood-filled, gastritis, meaning inflammation. So they'll get a stomach ache.
I would imagine that she would only let him know at the very end when he began to suffer intensely from the poison. She would be conveying to him that he would never leave her, ever.
But Vera's plans don't end with death.
She had a propensity for preserving her murdered males in zinc coffins in her basement.
The symbolism of trophies for serial killers is maybe something to brag about their event, even though they may not brag about it to another person. For them, they say, I've got this.
Vera collected morbid souvenirs.
A souvenir is something that a killer might keep to bring back good feelings of the individual, good feelings of the event, and something that's more personal.
For today's criminal investigators, there's an explanation for such bizarre behavior.
They want to hold on to that piece, that connection, and so people will try to hold on to bodies.
But without preservation, Vera's mementos would soon decompose.
Within 20 minutes of the time of death, our bodies begin to break down. The bacteria that are in our intestines, within 20 minutes, travel outside of our intestines and do what they do best. They start digesting things.
Vera had thought of everything.
Well, zinc, at least at the time that these crimes were committed, was probably the most expensive, the most long-lasting form of casket she could purchase. Embalming would be out of the question because it would let her secret out.
An airtight zinc casket and Vera's damp basement may have provided the ideal conditions for a type of mummification.
Adipose sear formation, where the fats in the body complex with the salts, calcium, sodium in water or in moist soil and form a soap-like or waxy consistency. Then the bodies will be preserved and eventually become hardened, almost stone-like.
This is almost a museum of death of her own design. Her victims are here, they're in her control.
Anytime she wanted to go talk with them and interact with them, she could. This would, for a while, serve a purpose and meet a need that she had. Eventually, it would cease to do so, and I think that's probably when she would go out and get another victim.
What drove Vera Renzi to such a macabre ritual? Modern analysis suggests she was simply looking for love.
Her first husband allegedly cheated on her, and this infuriated her. She had a terrible fear of rejection from males.
Vera set a course for revenge, but in a way that preserved the adoration of the men who followed.
Everybody wants to be loved, and once you have it, you always want to have it. But many of us lose it. We lose things that we love, as well as people that we love, and we usually go on. We'll mourn the loss or grieve or move on to something else to replace it. We don't kill.
Vera replaced love from the living with love from the dead. She killed for more than a decade until a suspicious wife called police to Vera's basement. They found 35 zinc coffins. Among the preserved victims, her 2 missing husbands. She lived 400 years ago, but the Countess's murderous motives still elude Dennis Bathory Kitts. His ancestor inhabits both his rational and creative mind. He's composing an opera about her.
This particular scene takes place when Elizabeth, the Blood Countess, has called a singer in the local church to her castle to sing for her. And the Countess keeps asking her, sing to me, sing to me, sing to me.
Through music, Dennis brings Elizabeth back to life, hoping to find meaning behind her malevolence. Over time, the Countess's behavior became more extreme as she yearned for youth and eternal beauty.
She would not only drain this blood to drink, but she would drain the blood and bathe in it and cover herself in it and luxuriate in a bath of warm blood.
For this, she needed even more victims.
There are 5 liters of blood in an adult human being. It takes only the loss of 1 liter, or 20% of the circulating blood volume, for the body to decompensate. In other words, for it to go into shock. Death would occur because simply there wouldn't be enough blood to go to the brain. And secondly, their heart would go into ventricular fibrillation or another abnormal heart rhythm. And then subsequently stop and respirations would stop.
We have to hear the story of Elizabeth because it reminds us that there are things we have to attend to, things that we have to prevent from ever happening again.
Dennis decides that to finish his work and to truly understand his murderous namesake, he must go to the scene of her crimes. "200 years after Elizabeth's reign, another deadly woman would become legend in the French Quarter of New Orleans.
The incident had such an impact on the city that for many years, many people wouldn't walk on the same side of the street as the house. Others avoided the block completely.
Amateur historian and tour guide Kalila Smith makes a regular stop at 1140 Royal Street.
The door was bolted and locked from the outside. They could hear screams and cries coming from within. The fortunate ones were dead.
It was here in 1834 what's believed to be the city's most horrendous crime was discovered.
I think that this history in New Orleans is far more bizarre than anything any fictional writer could possibly come up with.
Madame Delphine Lalaurie was an A-list socialite with money and connections.
Her husband was a surgeon, a very prominent surgeon in the city, and she was from a very wealthy French family. They were best known in the city for their lavish cocktail parties that they would throw, entertaining the upper echelon in the city, and they threw them quite frequently.
But Madame Lalaurie was not all she seemed.
As she was preparing for one of her cocktail parties, she was being attended to by a little 12-year-old slave girl by the name of Leah. Leah accidentally pulled Madame's hair as she was combing it. And in a fit of rage, Madame Lalaurie pulled out a bullwhip and proceeded to beat this little girl.
Trying to flee the beating, the little girl plunged to her death in the courtyard below.
Madame Lalaurie was brought before the courts for the death of this child. But because she was so influential, because she was rubbing elbows with all the upper echelon, she was given a mere slap on the wrist, a mere $300 fine.
Madame Lalaurie's notoriety would have ended there if it wasn't for a fire soon after. The story is still talked about by firemen today.
Well, that night, the alarm came in for our house, and when the firemen got there, they found a fire in the kitchen, and the slave told the firemen to go up to the third floor of the house and check it out.
The door was bolted and locked from the outside, yet they could hear screams and cries from within. Seasoned firemen who had obviously had experience with death before literally fell to their knees vomiting from the stench of death inside the room.
The firemen found a house of horror. It took a house fire to lay bare Madame Lalaurie, the New Orleans socialite, as a serial killer.
Upon entering one of the apartments, the most appalling spectacle met their eyes.
Corpses, people, slaves that were chained to the wall.
7 slaves, more or less horribly mutilated, were seen suspended by the neck, with their limbs apparently stretched and torn from one extremity to the other.
They found some that were buried under the flooring, mutilated bodies that were cut up.
Language is powerless and inadequate to give a proper conception of the horror which is a scene like this must have inspired.
It was just a real tragedy up there that they found.
That Madame Lalaurie had blood on her hands seems beyond doubt. Her motivation is less clear. One theory suggests Madame Lalaurie and her doctor husband were doing their own scientific research.
Well, people used to dig up graves and dissect bodies. This wasn't usually something done for a bizarre sacrifice. This was done out of human curiosity.
In the 1830s, knowledge of anatomy was limited. A curious but warped mind might see powerless slaves as lab rats.
And back then, we didn't even know precisely how blood circulated and how the body worked. It was fascinating.
That might have been the excuse, a quest for medical knowledge, but to be performing it on live people? No, it goes way beyond that.
The scant surviving evidence also points to another motivation.
The only word that comes to mind is a sadist. A sadist derives pleasure from inflicting pain on another individual. The pain can be physical or emotional or sexual, but the sadist delivers pleasure.
And still, there's another possibility.
The truth of the matter is that no matter how cruel her behavior, it might have been aimed at trying to solve a crime.
Lester Sullivan, archivist at Xavier University of Louisiana, thinks Madame LaLaurie might have been conducting her own cruel criminal investigation.
Shortly before the mansion caught on fire, there had been a rebellion on one of the plantations her family owned, downriver in St. Bernard Parish, in which her own mother was killed. Obviously, if she's got people chained and she's interrogating them under duress, probably involving torture and such, I mean, it takes a certain kind of ruthlessness to take this kind of action, to take the law into one's own hands.
It was some sort of distorted, displaced anger for some reason that she would go to such extremes to mutilate people the way she did.
Sadist, scientist, or avenger? We may never know.
Somehow the LaLauries escaped. Now, it's a mystery what happened to them. Many people believe that they wound up going down to the river and jumping ship. Some people say they even went back to Paris.
Whatever Madame LaLaurie's motivation, one thing more than anything else made her secret slayings possible: power. In the hands of deadly women, it's a lethal weapon. As the sick and gullible discovered in Washington State.
Linda Hazard was a leader. She was a speech maker. She commanded attention wherever she went. I mean, if she was somebody today, she'd be a household name. She'd be a superstar today. Dr. Hazard. I mean, it is the perfect name for a woman who perpetrates this type of crime. A doctor named Hazard. I mean, it's perfect.
When crime writer Greg Olson moved to Olalla, Washington, he found the perfect subject.
Turn-of-the-century medicine, quackery, greed, everything that you would ever imagine that you think is contemporary to today was going on back then, of course. And it happened here in Nowheresville.
In 1911, the sick and the wealthy were lured to these backwaters from Europe and the US on a promise. They came to cure their ills. Two wealthy sisters, Claire and Dora Williamson from England, were typical of Dr. Hazard's patients.
Is everything suitable? Yes, thank you.
The girls, they came, they thought this was going to be a holiday in the country. They were excited about going. They couldn't wait to get to Olalla. They had no idea what was in store for them.
For an upfront fee of $100 a week, the sisters would receive only a starvation diet and a place to die.
The diet that she developed was very strenuous. I mean, it was limited to 2 8-ounce glasses of a broth a day. Either a tomato or an asparagus broth was what she gave her patients.
Very good. Well done.
As a rule, fasting has been known throughout the centuries as a way to purify one's body and therefore purify one's mind.
Just pick them up.
There is no medical benefit to starving. Starvation causes death.
Common sense should have warned patients off the treatment within days, but Dr. Hazard's power usually prevailed.
The power of her mind and the power of her conviction was intoxicating for people. I mean, people would listen to her, and you could not help but believe what she was saying.
The sisters, like many others, persevered.
After we have gotten over the first day or two, maybe even 3, we are no longer going to feel hunger. We're going to at first feel a bit alert when we're starting to burn all the fats. But as we get through the fat and start burning off the protein, we're going to begin to get listless.
I think Dr. Linda Hazard was a serial killer, and a sadistic one at that. You don't even have to be a doctor to know if somebody is only fed diluted tomato juice on a daily basis that they eventually will die. She knew this, and she continued on with her experiment.
Dr. Linda Hazard's dietary experiments are remembered to this day.
I didn't know what a concentration camp was till after World War II, and then I saw pictures of it, and that's what those people looked like.
As a little girl, 80-year-old Lucienne Pendarvis had some frightening visitors. Escapees from the Hazard Clinic.
My mother used to feed them. Because they had to go right by her door, and she couldn't stand it. She would give them something to eat. They were just skin and bone, and their clothes just hung on them. Their eyes were sunk in, and they used to, we have what's called huckleberries here, and they would just strip those in the fall. Any kind of berry there was out there, they were eating it.
First, our immune systems are going to start to malfunction. And along with that, we're going to have this profound weakness. And then, eventually, we're not going to be able to maintain our blood pressure.
They grew weaker and weaker, but each time that they would complain about it or ask about it, Dr. Hazard would tell them, the cure is imminent, just a few more days. Hang on just a bit longer, and you'll have perfect, robust health. It'll just come in an instant.
Fortunately, the Pendarvis family didn't succumb to Dr. Hazard's spell.
And she also used to come down to the house because my dad had ulcers and he was sick, and she was going to cure him. But my mother and father had no part of what she was doing.
Claire and Dora Williamson consumed only broth for 2 whole months. Dr. Hazard's allure was finally overtaken by the will to live.
Claire knew this is my last chance. If I don't get out of here, I'm gonna die. And if I die, my sister's going to die. So Claire, somehow, we don't know how she even had the strength, somehow she crawled out of that attic and got out there to the woods and made it halfway down the hill before she realized she could go no further.
Feeble and disoriented, Claire's escape was short-lived.
Claire!
But when she heard Dr. Hazard's voice, it just like a spell, something came over her and she realized, I can't fight this. Unfortunately for Claire, there'd be no saving her. There was no end to Dr. Hazard's, really, her skill, if you want to call it, or her evil. I mean, not only did she treat these patients as their physician, She also acted as a coroner and did the post-mortem examinations on each one of her patients.
Dr. Hazard's failures were never registered. To the medical world, her victims died of various diseases.
The fact that the patient weighed less than 50 pounds was never on the certificate. It was always cirrhosis of the liver or something like that would be listed as the cause of death.
Today, the doctor's house of cruelty still stands. Its secrets not altogether lost.
You know, in this house, right here in this very spot, she was involved in actually cooking or preparing something. And so it's a strange feeling knowing that you're part of history living here in this house. The original bathtub is in there, and so apparently that's where she performed autopsies, in that bathtub.
The Jones family think they may be sharing this place with Dr. Hazard's victims.
It's funny, sometimes if you stand in here washing dishes and it just out of the corner of your eye, it's like there's a face just right there in the corner of the window. And so you'll look up and there's nobody there. It's eerie. There's always somebody here in the house with you, even if the house is empty and it's just you.
But Claire Williamson's death was a turning point in Dr. Hazard's career. Although there's no record of how, Dora managed to get a message out and was rescued. Dr. Hazard was convicted of manslaughter and jailed for 18 months. But she would be back.
This is what's sort of outrageous, really. She leaves town, and then she comes back. And the local people who knew all about this just sort of looked the other way.
Within 8 years, Dr. Hazard had renewed her practice. Her starvation diet again on the menu. There were more deaths.
The number is somewhere between 20 and 40 people, and we think some of them were disposed of here in this ravine. It's very deep. It's about probably a 100-foot drop from the house down. And, you know, wild animals, bears, all sorts of things have been out here. Cougars, you know, we have a lot of wildlife out here. So it's very possible if somebody was dumped down there that the body was dragged away.
The killing only stopped when the doctor herself became ill.
Well, this is kind of sweet, really, in the end. Linda Hazard got pneumonia, and she told the world, I'm going to cure myself by using the fast.
Justice came at her own hand.
And she fasted for, I think, 25 days before she basically killed herself and died by her own treatment. I think she had something to prove. I believe she did everything for the cure, that she really believed that by bringing this to people, that she was going to change the way we deal with medicine.
For criminal profiler Candace DeLong, it was delusion that killed Linda Hazard and her patients.
A delusion is a strong belief in something, an idea, a concept that has no basis in fact, and the person believes it despite overwhelming evidence to the contrary.
Could delusion also explain the crimes of Countess Bathory?
The victims are supposed to be buried around here.
Her descendant, Dennis Bathory Kitts, has traveled to Slovakia, to Chuktica Castle, looking for clues.
It is an incredible spot. It is unbelievable, kind of frightening place. And there is the rumor that in the dark side of that wall where the forest goes down quickly into the valley that the servant girls were dumped.
The Countess's quest for blood to keep her young was as powerful as it was perverse. Was it a simple iron deficiency or grotesque delusion?
The kind of woman who brutally murders for blood, to my way of thinking, is probably delusional or psychotic.
Dennis's ancestor lived in violent times when war and torture were the norm, when power was absolute.
Someone who is severely mentally ill and suffering from a delusion, it's probably going to be noticed or noticeable to those around them. Except we're going back 500 years to a woman who was very wealthy and was a countess, and oftentimes at those higher levels, mental illness and strange behavior is ignored.
Ignored and isolated. The Blood Countess lived beyond reproach by the townspeople below. Peasant servants could be killed without repercussion.
It was possible for her to get away with anything here because the only people around were her trusted servants, other royalty, and those who would never speak again, the girls.
Countess Bathory was locked in a deadly cycle of delusion, with nothing and no one to bring her back to reality.
And oftentimes, the more a person tries to get that thought out of their mind or that feeling out of their heart, the less they're able to do so. And oftentimes, the more the individual thinks about it, it kind of develops a life of its own. It feeds on itself.
Although many generations separate Dennis from his ancestor, he feels obliged to redress the crime.
There comes a time when the people who perpetrated the evil have to say, even if it's generations down the line, we're sorry for having done this to you.
Dennis is about to visit the small town of Chukhtitsa, from where many of the Countess's victims came. He has no idea what sort of reception he'll receive. Many in Chukhtitsa claim a family connection to the life and crimes of the Blood Countess. Dennis has invited 20 of the town's dignitaries, including the mayor, to an appropriate venue, Pizzeria Bathory.
This is a reconciliation meal today to reconcile the Bathory family with the people of Chukhtitsa.
What will they make of this thoughtful American following his obsession to the other side of the world?
Dobry den, pani Ištokova.
The moment arrives for Dennis to make his peace.
Dnes na sobie nemám nic cenného, tedy barvu noci. I said, first of all, that I wasn't wearing black, which is the color of night, and I wasn't wearing red, which was the color of blood, but instead I was wearing violet, which was the color of healing. And I said that it was time for a healing between the family of all the Bathorys, which I was representing today, and the people of Chukhtitsa for the deeds that were done 400 years ago by the Countess. And I hoped with the gift of friendship, it would be better both today and in the future.
And I would like to thank you for all you've done. And you are welcome anytime here. And they're not angry with you anymore. You are our friends, you are not our enemies.
Elizabeth Bathory, Vera Renzi, Delphine Lalaurie, and Linda Hazard, all in the grip of a human failing, seated tragically in youth,
We know from studying killers that oftentimes the fantasies that they have, that they end up acting out in their murder, is a fantasy that they started having in their early teens. Vera Renzi, perhaps her father left her. Perhaps she was abandoned by both parents. But whatever it was, it left a very, very serious scar on her psyche. Research conducted by the FBI into serial killers and sadists revealed that the vast majority of them come from families in which they were mistreated as children. And oftentimes these children are abused. Or they act out the obsession because they believe or they feel they will feel better and it will be over with once they do this. And for a while they do feel better after they commit the act, but the feeling doesn't last. The act never lives up to their fantasy. Why? Because a fantasy's in your mind and you can control every aspect of it. Reality is much different.
Dennis Bathory Kitts has one last appointment to keep. To confront the Blood Countess face to face.
I think this painting is absolutely frightening. The eyes, the pose, the stillness, and when you know what happened behind that stillness, is even more terrifying.
Elizabeth never cheated age nor death. After murdering a noblewoman, her bloody history was exposed. She was walled into her castle tower. The only mercy, food pushed through a slot. She died alone and old. Her obsession unrealized.
Power, search for youth, madness. It's so impossible to know what it is that drove her to do this.
These are the stories of women who committed their crimes in different eras, on different continents, for different reasons. For love.
Whenever she found disappointment with the current husband, she disposed of him and went on to the next one.
For money.
By all accounts, she was pleasant. It's just that she couldn't stop killing people for gain.
For attention.
She wasn't only killing, she was saving patients too.
For escape.
All I was thinking of was getting rid of him.
But to the criminal profiler, they are a disturbing sisterhood.
Whereas you or I may go out for a jog, these people kill.
A criminal class beyond suspicion.
Do nurses in Northampton go to work every day thinking, oh, I have to be on the lookout for a serial killer?
Using the most effective tools.
She was just a real nice little old lady.
Their gender.
Played the role perfectly.
And their weapon of choice, poison.
To sit back and watch someone who's slowly being eaten away from the inside out is vicious.
In the Tulsa City Library in Oklahoma, Sherby Green confronts her demons.
Every family has the proverbial skeleton in their closet. Actually, my family has quite a few of them.
Sherby's family skeletons remained hidden by her protective father.
He said, you better just leave things alone. Just leave them where they're at. He said, you might just find out a whole lot more that you don't want to know.
Now, after 50 years, Sherby Green wants the truth. Why her third cousin became one of America's most notorious serial killers, Nanny Doss.
From her track record, it looks that anyone who got on her wrong side, they signed their own death warrant.
Nanny is thought to have killed 14 people, all by poison. Over the next week, Sherby hopes to meet her murderous cousin, even though Nanny's been dead for 38 years.
Well, there's a couple of things that I hope to find out, but I guess the most prominent one would be the why, to understand the woman.
Sherby's search will take her to the darkest corners of the human mind.
A killer's family has a very difficult time balancing out mentally what has happened.
Dr. Deborah Sherman Coughlin knows Sherby's destination. A criminal profiler for 17 years, Dr. Sherman Coughlin has investigated and interviewed many murderers. But intriguing her most are female killers, and why most of them turn to poison.
They typically choose poisons because they tend to be in a caregiver role, and they have access to feeding an individual or injecting an individual. It's something that's easy for them to obtain. It's something that is more difficult to trace.
Poison is an ancient weapon. Convenient, non-confrontational, secretive. Statistically, women are 5 times as likely to use it as men.
It's more difficult for a female to wield a knife and use a knife to cut a victim, whereas it's a lot easier to put poison in someone's food. A female serial killer will choose a victim who's already helpless. They will choose young children. They will choose the elderly. They will choose sick victims. They will choose family members who are close to them. So they're choosing someone who is already somewhat under their control.
From 1945 to 1954, Nanny Doss uses her kitchen to kill 4 husbands. Victim Sam Doss is a typical study.
I believe he was a very quiet, very strict man due to his religious beliefs. He didn't let her play the radio, wouldn't let her run the fan at night, wouldn't let her go next door to a neighbor's house and watch TV. And he just got tired of having to follow his strict house rules and decided she wanted out of it.
One day, Nanny adds rat poison, available at the corner store, to Sam's favorite dessert, stewed prunes.
Poison Control Center, how may I help you? How long ago was this?
I would take him to the emergency room as soon as possible.
If Sam Doss was poisoned today, this type of facility might have saved his life.
Wipe out his mouth with some room temperature water.
We get about 200 or so calls a day. I would say over the course of a year, we probably get about 60,000 calls.
Dr. Lewis Nelson deals with accidental poisonings at New York City's Poison Control Center.
Sure, go ahead. There's a lot of poisoning going on because there's a lot of chemicals out there, there's a lot of medicines out there, there's a lot of occupational exposures as well, so there is a lot of poisoning going on.
Occasionally, among Dr. Nelson's cases is arsenic, the active ingredient in Nanny's rat poison.
Arsenic's been used for thousands of years. It's a naturally occurring poison. It comes in rock formations and you can extract it fairly easily. It's been identified as being toxic for literally thousands of years, and it's been used over the millennium as homicidal agents to knock off powerful figures and emperors and other figures like that.
Tasteless and odorless, arsenic moves quickly through the bloodstream. Within 30 minutes, Sam Doss's major organs will be contaminated. But this time, due to an overdose, Sam's body fights back.
If you ingest something that irritates your stomach, what happens is that the stomach essentially contracts in reverse and squeezes from the bottom up. At the same time, the sphincter, the muscle that controls the opening and closing of the esophagus, opens, allowing the food to come from the stomach up into the esophagus and then out through the mouth. And that would be vomiting.
This reflex action stops much of the poison from entering Sam's bloodstream. Although ill, he will not die.
She overdid it that time. The first time she gave him enough to make him sick enough to throw it up, so it didn't have any effect.
Sherby Green tracks down a first-hand account of Nanny's next steps.
Heidi.
I'm Sherby Green.
Sherby?
W. Dean Heidi, MD, is a respected Tulsa banker. In 1954, he was Sam Doss's doctor.
I first saw Sam in my office. He was quite ill, and this was during a flu epidemic in Tulsa, and we were seeing lots of people, but he was so ill, I felt that he needed to be admitted to the hospital. And I don't recall exactly how long he was in, 3 or 4 days maybe, but he improved, got better, and we sent him home.
But Sam's days are numbered.
This time she measured it out and she got it right.
The smaller dose is carried swiftly to Sam's organs.
Arsenic is what's known as a multi-system toxin or a multi-organ toxin. It pretty much poisons everything.
Arsenic strikes at the core of almost every cell. Energy powerhouses called mitochondria. Here, food is turned into energy, keeping us alive. It's known as the Krebs cycle, and arsenic shuts it down by blocking crucial enzymes.
And when your enzymes in your individual cells don't work, the cells fail. When the cells fail, the organs fail, and when the organs fail, the body fails.
Sam's brain, kidneys, liver, and lungs are being starved of energy.
An individual who poisons a human being is sinister. To sit back and watch someone who's slowly being eaten away from the inside out is vicious. It's immoral. You have to have no conscience to sit back and watch someone, especially someone you know, slowly deteriorating in front of your eyes.
Under the cover of an anguished wife, Nanny admits Sam to the hospital. Sam's doctor is perplexed.
I had several specialists take a look at him to see if there was something that I was missing, and they couldn't come up with anything. But he continued just to go downhill and died.
But is there anything in particular that stuck in your memory about Nanny?
Well, other than she was just a real nice little old lady who played the role perfectly.
That's the masks that they wear. They hide behind that assumption that a little old lady couldn't possibly have done this. They use that to their advantage so that they can be more effective in their murdering.
The frightening thing is Sam wasn't the first. He was the last in a long line of deaths that surrounded Nanny by poisoning.
"14 of Nanny's family or friends perish. She defies suspicion for 27 years, but not for much longer. Sam Doss will have his revenge from the grave."
I have here a copy of his death certificate, and if you'll notice, it's all typed in, except the cause of death and, of course, my signature, because they didn't know what to type.
After Dr. Heidi's late revelation of arsenic poison, Nanny is arrested and charged. But the real hero is a science forged a century before, across the Atlantic. A time when Victorian England is gripped by a poison epidemic, breeding their most notorious female killer. The forensic toxicology used to convict Nanny Doss was refined in England's 19th century medical laboratories.
Toxicology, as a newly developing subject, spends an awful lot of time talking about arsenic and trying to develop more and more sophisticated tests to detect it.
For medical historian Dr. Ian Burney, there's no doubt why Victorian scientists were obsessed with arsenic.
Victorian England is awash in poison. It's on the wallpaper. It's in the medicines. It's in the sweets. It's on the floors to kill the vermin. So it's available.
By the 1850s, arsenic murders are rampant. The salt earns a nickname: inheritance powder. Extracting it from victims, exposing evidence, becomes a forensic fixation.
It was actually considered in Victorian times the crime of the age. The crudeness of the past had given way to more refined and civilized ways of interacting, so they had a civilized way of murdering.
And the most civilized of all will be Mary Ann Cotton, England's worst female serial killer.
By all accounts, she was pleasant. She'd been a nurse twice. She'd been a good nurse, a caring nurse. It's just that she couldn't stop killing people for gain.
Detective Inspector Paul Heslop solved many murders before he retired.
I used to be a constable here and later on a detective constable.
Now a crime writer, his imagination draws him to Britain's most poisonous woman.
I think it was a woman in search for security in those days, you know. A woman didn't have anything. You know, they had to have the man for the house and the job that went with it and everything else.
In the 1800s, marriage means security. By coincidence, Paul Heslop's old beat passes the church where Mary Ann wed one of her victims on September 17th, 1870.
I think when she came here and got married to Frederick Cotton, she probably thought she had a catch, if you like. She had a working man, she had an income, she had a family, she had a house. But then, as time passed, it seemed there was always something else manifested, and Mary Ann wanted that. She wanted the something else. And once she wanted something else, it was just too easy to get rid of what she'd got to get the something else.
On their first wedding anniversary, Frederick Cotton is in no condition to celebrate. He's dying of arsenic poison. Mary Ann poisons for profit.
Burial clubs were a common way for poorer members of society to ensure that their loved ones had a decent and proper funeral that they could pay for.
Burial insurance extends to children. The Cotton's year-old son dies of poison 6 months after Frederick.
You pay a couple of pence per month into a fund, and after a certain period of time, you will be allocated a lump sum. So you could, for the investment of, I don't know, sort of 20 pence over the course of a few years, you could potentially be seeing a return of 3, 4, 5, 10 pounds.
Early death and a pauper's burial delivers dividends.
Once again, my condolences, ma'am.
And because arsenic symptoms mimic gastric infections, common at this time of poor hygiene, Mary Ann is above suspicion. It's thought she poisons 3 husbands, a lover, her mother, a friend, and at least 12 of her own children and stepchildren.
Well, not just a woman, but a person who would kill her own flesh and blood would appear to me to be callous and ruthless. And in Mary Ann Cotton's case, if it was done for gain, particularly so.
More than 130 years later, Sherby Green discovers Nanny also killed 2 of her children.
It's the worst that she could have done, is to poison her own children. It's believed she poisoned her sisters, her mother, many other family members, but her own children, her own flesh and blood. You know, these are the children that she carried for 9 months that she gave life to.
A mother could kill her own flesh and blood if she is a psychopath or if she is insane. The psychopath is the individual who has no bonding or no attachments and no empathy for others. The only person who matters to the psychopath is the psychopath.
Criminal profiler Dr. Deborah Sherman Coughlin believes Nanny and Mary Ann share another trait. They were drifters, using distance to blur the pattern of their misfortune.
If you have one body in one jurisdiction and one body in another jurisdiction, if they're not talking to each other, then you have what's called linkage blindness, where they don't see that these crimes are related.
But one piece of police work can't be fooled by gender or geography. A technique still used today in modern toxicology labs, like the Office of the Chief Medical Examiner in New York.
We very rarely see arsenic cases, but every once in a while, if there is a suspicion of an acute arsenic overdose, we do use the range test to screen for arsenic.
Head of the lab is Dr. Marina Stajich.
So it's a very simple test. 3 pieces of copper wire. And I have a positive control that contains a known amount of arsenic, a negative control, and a urine sample, which we're going to test for the presence of arsenic. This is what they would have done in Mary Ann Cotton's day.
After heating with hydrochloric acid, the poison in the positive control and the urine sample should be revealed.
This was the negative control. The copper wire didn't change.
The arsenic emerges. Deposited on the wire is a black metallic coating.
What was the unknown specimen, there is also a black deposit. These two would indicate the presence of arsenic.
Developed more than 160 years ago by scientist Hugo Reinsch, the test helps convict Mary Ann Cotton and Nanny Doss.
Arsenic is actually one of the easier poisons to detect. One of the reasons being that it's actually a mineral poison, so it stays in the body.
The dead can speak, their bodies revealing all to the toxicologist. Mary Ann is sentenced to death by hanging. Her notoriety becomes a nursery rhyme.
Mary Ann Cotton, she's dead and she's rotten. She lies in a bed with her eyes wide open. Sing, sing, what can I sing? Mary Ann Cotton is tied up with string. Where, up in the air.
You was asking about the electric chair. Let me take you over and...
Nanny Doss is more fortunate. She is spared the electric chair, now displayed at the Oklahoma State Penitentiary Museum.
It's not still plugged up, is it?
No, it's over here in the back corner.
In 1955, no Oklahoma judge wants to be first to execute a woman.
Now, this is the what y'all nicknamed Sparky, is that
This is the one that was nicknamed Sparky.
It's not a very pretty picture, is it?
No. I think we've executed 81 or 2 in the electric chair, and the last one was in 1966.
Was there ever a woman in it?
No, ma'am.
I think that knowing how many she actually murdered with her poisonous potion, I think she deserved the chair. I really did. To be allowed to live after she took so many lives is, to me, it was a reward.
The evolving science of toxicology brings many poisoners undone. But to this day, a clever, educated, determined woman can defy detection. Night Duty, Veterans Affairs Hospital, Northampton, Massachusetts, 1995. It should be a quiet time of convalescing, but one nurse will see that it's not. Kristen Gilbert murders her patients using the ultimate cover: her gender and her profession. In Massachusetts, she becomes known as the Angel of Death.
Do nurses in Northampton go to work every day thinking, oh, I have to be on the lookout for a serial killer? Absolutely not. They don't want to believe it.
Author M. William Phelps, who covered this case, says Kristen believed she was committing the perfect crime. She was above suspicion, her weapon untraceable.
Here you have a blonde, 30-year-old soccer mom driving around in an SUV during the day, taking her kids to soccer practice, volunteering her time at the homeless shelters.
Professionally, Kristen is smart, reacting swiftly in emergencies. No one knows she is creating them.
Henry Houdin was a 35-year-old vet. He was a physically healthy human being, and he had been admitted to the hospital because he had this severe case of the flu. Now, Gilbert, according to the U.S. Attorney's Office, injects him with a dose of epinephrine.
The drug epinephrine stimulates the heart. It's commonly used to treat cardiac arrest, but it can also induce one.
The feeling you get when you run, which is increasing sense of your heart beating or palpitations, your blood pressure rises, you flush. These type of symptoms are exactly what you expect when somebody's given epinephrine.
Picture this. Epinephrine's injected into your arm. Your arm immediately gets hot and it starts burning. Your heart starts racing out of control and you go into massive cardiac arrest.
Kristen calls an emergency code, a hospital alert to the cardiopulmonary resuscitation unit, or CPR. Little does the CPR team know they will only make things worse.
All right, we're gonna have to shock him. Clear.
When a CPR team comes in the setting of a patient in cardiac arrest, one of the very common things you might consider doing is giving epinephrine, which would be a great drug to give in most settings, except in the setting of epinephrine-induced cardiac arrest. Then you'd be basically giving the patient a double dose.
If Gilbert gives an injection of epinephrine to kill this person, and the doctors come in and they give him more epinephrine, you tell me, how are they going to find out that she's using epinephrine to kill these people?
Incredibly, despite the double epinephrine dose, Henry Houdin survives. For the moment.
45 minutes go by. All of a sudden, another code is called by Gilbert on Houdin. He goes back into this cardiac arrest.
Clear.
Investigators believe she injected him for a second time. They save him again. This was a strong man. He fought for his life. He wanted to live, this guy. He wasn't gonna let a 30-year-old soccer mom take his life from him, okay?
Twice more that night, the CPR team is called to Henry Houdin.
Another code is called. Lo and behold, another code. Oh my God, on Henry Houdin. He goes into massive cardiac arrest, but this time they just cannot save him. He goes brain dead. They cannot save his life.
Kristen's tracks are covered by legitimate doses of epinephrine.
People have to think about looking for it. It's not something that's commonly looked for as a cause of death, especially if you're not considering homicide.
So why does Kristen kill people she hardly knows? Prosecutors believe her motive is ego.
During code situations, she was the go-to nurse. She was the take-charge nurse. She took charge of them codes. She gave orders. She directed traffic. She knew exactly what to do.
Criminal profiler Dr. Deborah Sherman Coughlin recognizes this behavior. It's known as Munchausen syndrome by proxy.
Munchausen is a condition where typically it's a caregiver who will harm either a child or someone who's in his or her care, and then come in and act like a hero in order to get a high and attention and look like a hero. And they crave that excitement, and so they do that over and over and over again.
And there was one person Kristen wanted to impress more than anyone, her lover, the hospital security guard.
When she would inject her victims with the epinephrine, the security guard always had to come to the codes. He was required to do that. And she would flirt with the security guard when she was coding the victims and killing the victims.
During one code, one nurse reported, Gilbert was on top of a patient, straddling a patient like one would straddle a horse. She lifts up her skirt. "Look at my garter." And she wanted to show it off while a poor man is fighting for his life.
Kristen Gilbert will regret her final bid for attention. Disguising her voice, she makes a series of bomb threats to the hospital.
Yeah, police officer Prospect, may I help you?
This is my last call. In 25 minutes, I'll see you in hell.
Narcissists, they have to act out. They need an audience. This phone gave her the stage to reach her audience at the Veterans Affairs Hospital.
Police trace the call, finding Kristen's fingerprints on the phone.
It was her undoing because about a week after making this phone call, they got the search warrant, they got their evidence, and they made an arrest. They found this handbook of poisoning, tattered and torn, in the pantry of her home. And they also found intravenous medications. This book, what is the page that's ripped out? What is the page that's most tattered and torn in this book? The page is epinephrine. So she was clearly studying this page.
Kristen's homework doesn't surprise Dr. Deborah Sherman Coughlin.
What I found when I interviewed female serial killers was that they would get books on pathology, criminal investigation, forensic science, and then they would read that information, learn about that information, incorporate it into their fantasies first, and then begin experimenting and use that in their crimes. They learn all about criminal investigation and killing to find out the perfect way to do it without getting caught.
But Kristen does get caught. Not by toxicology, but by traditional police work. She's serving 4 consecutive life sentences for murder. Some believe there may have been more.
Authorities explained to me that there's a possibility that she could have killed 75 people. If that's true, then she would be one of the most prolific serial killers in this country.
Kristen Gilbert, like Marianne Cotton and Nanny Doss, crossed a line few would dare, from fantasy to deathly reality. A choice also made by a woman in Canberra, Australia, as she struggled between good and evil.
All I was thinking, I was getting rid of him. That was the first thing that entered my mind. I said, this man's got to go.
Anne-Marie Hughes tells a disturbing story of the time she tries to poison her husband.
Now, he has been complaining about, oh, I feel sick for years and years and years. Well, my mind turned and I said, well, I'll bloody give you something to make you feel sick, you bugger.
I think that sometimes we can get angry and we may think about, gosh, that person really upset me, and boy, wouldn't it be nice if that person weren't here anymore. But the problem comes in when you start taking steps to make that fantasy into reality, and that's what Anne-Marie did.
Anne-Marie's 4th marriage is in crisis. She believes it to be an irretrievable breakdown. Divorce is in the cards. She's done it twice before. This time, she chooses a different path.
I met up with a clairvoyant. She said that he wouldn't live a long life. And she thought it would be a good idea that Mr. Hughes should go. So it was her idea. She's the one that talked me into the oleander.
The clairvoyant strenuously denies any involvement. But for whatever reason, Anne-Marie buys several oleander plants.
what did I do? I cut the leaves off because they're only miniature plants, only tiny plants about 18 inches. So I just cut the leaves off, just put the roots in and boiled it.
Oleander is a very, very commonly available plant. It grows on the roadside in many countries. It's planted by municipalities because they produce beautiful flowers and long, slender leaves, and they're very hardy and they grow very well.
They're also deadly, containing a chemical which, if ingested, disrupts the heartbeat.
Cardioactive steroids, like what you find in oleander, interfere with the way the heart depolarizes and repolarizes, the way the heart beats and relaxes.
Well, I just poured a little bit in, like that.
Anne-Marie believes her marriage troubles will soon be over.
I felt bad about it, but I said, I've got to do this just to show this man that he can be brought to heel like everybody else. I had approached him to go to marriage guidance counselling, and he didn't hear me. He never wore his hearing aids, and all I ever got from him was, "I can't hear you." In other words, he turned the hearing aid off so he couldn't hear. And I just said, well, something's got to give.
I guess tuning a car would be one way to look at it. If you time it a little too early, you don't burn your fuel efficiently. If you time it a little too late, you don't burn your fuel efficiently. If you time it far too much on either side, the engine just won't start. Altering it in either direction, which is exactly what a cardioactive steroid would do, could produce a malfunctioning heart.
The initial dose induces only a mild illness. Her husband's and her own reaction is not what Anne-Marie expects.
Oh God, I should not be doing this. And then I'd stop it for a while.
It will be the first of several doses. Anne-Marie is in torment.
It's not very pleasant trying to take someone's life. He was going through a lot of bad symptoms, and he said, "Oh God, if this is life, what is death?"
Fortunately for Anne-Marie and her husband, oleander's cardioactive steroids don't accumulate in the body.
So you'd have an acute poisoning, it would go away over the next day or two, and the symptoms you experienced would resolve, and then you'd have another episode of acute poisoning which would resolve until the dose got just right.
But Anne-Marie never gets the dose just right. In fact, when she isn't poisoning her husband, she's trying to save him with massage.
I did the cleansing of the stomach with the hands. That's, you go around across the top there and down there, and you follow the line of the bowel, and you get rid of all the stuff.
Anne-Marie finds herself torn between wife and killer.
Seeing how you're making someone suffer, and then, trying to do something about it. You've got, it gives you that you've got a dual personality.
For 6 weeks, Anne-Marie lives a double life. until instinct wins out.
I went into one of my neighbours who was living next door and told them what had happened, and they rang the police, and that's when I ended up in the position I am.
Anne-Marie confesses and is charged with endangering her husband's life. While she's in jail, she's diagnosed with severe depression and slides further downhill. At her trial a year later, the judge orders her release on medical grounds.
Oftentimes, these offenders have high stress levels in their lives. They're unhappy, they've been unhappy all of their lives, they feel put upon, they feel they have too many burdens. And so killing for them is often a form of stress relief.
It's mind-boggling what I went through. And now I look back, I wonder how I had the courage and the conviction to do it. But then when you're pushed beyond your limit with years of abuse, what else can you do?
Homicidal poisoning affects more than its victims. Perpetrators, survivors, friends, and relatives are left grappling for answers.
The court believes that the people and legislature of our Christian and enlightened state have never contemplated...
In the McFarland Library at the University of Tulsa, Sherby Green finds an original recording from the trial of Nanny Doss.
This court has never heard of any woman being put to death for any crime in Oklahoma. It may happen.
Sherby's hoping to hear her cousin to help complete the portrait in her mind of a lost woman looking for love.
I believe Nanny killed her husbands because none of them came up to her expectations. They all kept letting her down. One was, a womanizer. One was a drunkard. One was too religious, so whenever she found disappointment with the current husband, she disposed of him and went on to the next one.
I therefore sentence you, Nanny Doss, to a term of imprisonment for your natural life in the state penitentiary.
Disappointingly, only the judge is recorded, leaving just one place left to explore. Oklahoma State Penitentiary, where Nanny spent her final days.
Okay, so this is the actual place where Nanny was...
Right, this is the actual building where she was housed. It's been closed about 2 years.
Nanny died here of leukemia, 10 years to the day of her imprisonment.
This is the actual housing unit where she would have done time, and there would have been beds in here, and this would be it. If you was expecting cells, I'm afraid we disappointed you a little bit.
I had read a couple of the articles in the newspaper where she had said that they wouldn't allow her to work in the kitchen.
Right, but they let her sew, and then of course their laundry was a big job.
Given Nanny's history, I can't very well blame them for not letting her work in the kitchen.
I wouldn't want her working in my kitchen either. Okay.
It's wondering what she thought, how she felt. Did she stand at that window and look out and ask herself, why? Why did I do this? Why did I take those lives? Why did I put myself in this place?
The answers may lie in a place Sherby hasn't considered. A place of pain for the sisterhood of poisonous women.
Dr. Sherman, please.
Yeah, speaking.
Dr. Sherman, this is Sherby Green. I wanted to talk to you a little bit about Nanny.
Well, Nanny appears to be a psychopath who doesn't have the same feelings of concern or caring or bonding with others that you or I might have.
For almost 2 decades, Dr. Deborah Sherman Coughlin has drilled into criminal minds.
She would view them as burdens to be gotten rid of so that she could get what she wanted, and really
She's convinced murderous women all have something in common: a troubled childhood.
Okay.
Well, what we see in the backgrounds of Nanny Doss and Marianne Cotton are the horrific upbringing, the terribly poor childhood, the abusive childhood, the lack of attachment and bonding evident from an early age.
Nanny grew up in rural Alabama. Although a friendly community, her hot-headed father kept her in virtual isolation. Socializing was forbidden. Marianne Cotton's childhood was also repressed. Already poor, her father fell to his death in a coal mine, plunging the family further into hardship. Kristen Gilbert had difficulties as a teenager. The more she became alienated, the more she developed a pattern of lies and deceit. Anne Marie Hughes suffered unspeakable brutality from those she felt should have loved her.
My father-in-law continually raped me for many years, and I couldn't do anything about it because I didn't know what to do. No love shown. No love was given to us as children. I didn't know what love was all about. I still don't. I find it very hard sometimes to show any feelings. I can hide my feelings pretty well, don't you worry. I've had to learn.
Dr. Sherman Coughlin believes this early powerlessness begins a tragic, unattainable quest.
Because they have no control over their lives, they begin to turn inward psychologically, and they begin to fantasize about the perfect life. They fantasize about a Prince Charming, an idealized romance to take them away. Then they find out that reality is not as good as fantasy, and they cannot deal with it. And so their fantasies then turn from something that's pleasant, such as a nice family environment, to something that's a bit more dark.
From this darkness, Sherby Green can find some light.
She was in search of the perfect love. And we all know that there's no such thing as a perfect love. I'm sorry for her in one sense, because she never found what she looked for. It saddens me to know that there's not just her, but so many people in the world who search for that inner peace.
The deeds of these 4 women have been exposed. But, disturbingly, Dr. Sherman Coughlin believes many are not.
Female poisoners can get away with their crimes. They hide behind the fact that people don't want to believe that a female could commit such an atrocious crime. Male serial killers make up approximately 85% of all convicted serial killers, while female serial killers only make up about 15%. But just because the incarceration figures are only 15% doesn't mean that women aren't killing more. It just means they're better at what they do. There are female killers and poisoners out there that we don't know about, just simply because they're not being detected. They're still out there.